The information contained in this video is intended for educational purposes. We are not responsible for any damage to your device resulting from improper disassembly or installation. Proceed at your own risk.
This is an advanced level repair. There are lots of things that can go wrong. If you don't have experience with this kind of repair, by all means seek the help of a professional or at least have someone coach you along the way. This is a tough one even for a lot of people who have experience already. Among the things that can go wrong during this repair, we have a damaged LCD. There's adhesive running down on either side of the LCD, and you've got to be very, very precise and careful and patient in the way that you remove the LCD from the housing. A little bit too much pressure and it's easy to crack. They do have a certain amount of flexibility, but you can definitely damage them. iPad minis in general are susceptible to what we call ghost touch, which means a digitizer will start to do things on its own. A lot of that is due to the interference at the bottom end of the tablet, and I'll show you how we can kind of minimize the probability of that happening. Home buttons tend to glitch out if they're not supreme quality replacement parts. You'll get a lot of home buttons that are just kind of hanging there and they're just not assembled properly. And sometimes you have to go back in and adjust them. So always be prepared to take the new screen off and reinstall it if you run into any of these problems. Adhesive failure is another issue that's generally caused by misalignment of the flex cable at the bottom, or the magnets getting off center a little bit, or the housing of the iPad being bent. Again, I'll show you how to install this and hopefully you won't run into this problem, but down at the bottom right hand corner of the device, that's something that happens quite often to a lot of people. Backlight component damage is another big risk. You don't want voltage flowing through some of the components that are designed to protect the LCD. So unfortunately, that means that if you make the mistake of disconnecting and reconnecting the LCD while you have power flowing through the device, there's a pretty good chance that you can damage one of these components. So just to be safe, you definitely want to avoid that any way you can. Also, the Digitizer LCD interfaces on these are very, very fragile. Always disconnect the battery first and reconnect it last. That will minimize your chances of doing any damage to the backlight components. The damage to this iPad is not really that bad, but you'll see as I go to remove the screen, it does tend to get a little bit worse. So what we always want to do is make sure whenever possible that we do power down the device before we start working on it. And then once we get inside, just to be safe, we will go ahead and disconnect the battery to make sure that we don't have any power flowing through. Also, of course, you don't want to be plugged into a lightning connector when you do this. So when it powers down, you're going to find that the majority of the adhesive that holds the screen on is going to be at the top and the bottom where those thick stripes are. As you go down the sides, it's not too tough to get that apart. And in some cases, you might even want to start prying from the sides and work your way along towards the top and the bottom. When you do that, make sure that you don't go in too far with your pry tool, because one thing that's really tricky about this is pushing the adhesive that's beneath the glass onto the Retina display. And once you do that, it's very difficult to clean and you'll almost never get it looking brand new again. You can usually clean it off pretty well, but it just likes to hold on to any kind of oils, adhesives, or anything that comes into contact with it. And you can see up here at the top, I started with a dulled razor blade and just heated this up a little bit. And I like to do that just to get myself started so I can get in between the two surfaces. Once I do, I switch over to this thin pry tool. These large thin triangles are really good for this particular application. Although, again, these things are very sticky and very fragile, so if you pull on it a little bit too hard, you'll definitely crack it. Be prepared for that. Always have your safety goggles on. You never know when a piece of glass is going to come flying up at you. And in this business, it does quite often. So you'll see I'm just going to go ahead and continuously keep this thing heated up to about the 100-degree Fahrenheit range, and that will make the adhesive much easier to work with. And you can just kind of slide or even roll the pry tool down the side or across the top here. There's not too much on the inside that you really have to worry about damaging. The main thing is to make sure that you don't go in all the way down to where the display is. And you'll see here it's going to start cracking apart. This is going to happen quite often when you have cracks that go all the way to the edge. So don't let that discourage you. You just have to be patient and keep going. And you can see here I actually started to use a playing card. Didn't have a lot of luck with that, so I just grabbed a second pry tool. And again, these work out really well for this type of separation. Now you can see I'm actually going further in, but when I do that, I'm lifting the glass away from the display. So when my pry tool goes in further than that white stripe, it's actually not coming into contact with the display. And because the flex cables are located at the bottom, we're going to open this up from the top end first. And here the trick is just to make sure no glass falls down and gets stuck against the display. So you'll notice I just kind of keep it open here while I'm working on it. And I usually put on rubber gloves at about this point, because if you get a fingerprint on this display, you will be able to clean it up, but it will never look brand new again. You're always going to have that little faint residue from your fingers that gets on here. And if you clean it, it just kind of smears around. It's really, really difficult to get these things back to looking pristine. So the rubber gloves help out a lot. You don't get any of the impurities from the oil in your hands into the device. Now when we take this glass off, you'll notice that there are a few things that are stuck to it that we are going to salvage and transfer over to the new display unless it comes with them. Make sure that when you're pulling the glass away from the tablet that it doesn't bend in half and start pushing down on the display. In fact, you want to kind of avoid having it make any contact with the display whatsoever. So you see down here at the bottom, I've finally just kind of pulled this away. And again, there's a lot of adhesive down there you have to work around. There are a few other things that we have to get to here on the inside as well. It's very interesting the way they put this together. Now take a close look at the bend in the flex cable down here. I know that's not a perfectly clear shot. I'll try to put a still up here for you. But when you put this back together, you want to make sure you have this bent in exactly the same orientation. Otherwise, you can have problems with the lens pulling up from the frame. So I just backed up here a little bit. And again, I'm peeling this off very carefully towards the bottom. You can see the home button is stuck to the digitizer, and that's the way they come in. And we've got some adhesive around the edges, so I'm just kind of pulling away so we can separate these, but be very careful as you're working around this area down here at the bottom. Now, we're not too worried about this cable since it is part of the old digitizer that's going to be going into the trash, but for the sake of reference, I recommend that you hold on to it just so you can take a look at exactly the way everything's installed, including the magnets on the sides, the orientation of the flex cable, and the guard that goes around the camera at the top here, which you'll see shortly. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of work my way around. We've got to get all the glass out of the corners so that we can expose the, and there's a little padded piece of adhesive here. We need to peel off, and this will expose those 4 corner screws that hold the LCD into place. So just work very carefully getting all this stuff separated. And once you do, you should be able to see all 4 of these, and they're completely different sizes from the rest of the screws inside the tablet. Do keep these in order so that you don't get anything mixed up. And we're going to just go ahead and remove as much adhesive as we can for the moment. We can always come back and clean this up later on once we get the LCD out of the housing. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of heat to the back and to the front, and it's a little hard to explain this next part. What we have to do is kind of pry very carefully on the edges here so that we lift the LCD adhesive away from the plate that's underneath here. Now the problem is it's very, very easy to break this if you're not careful. So just a little bit of heat, and you've got to be really gentle. Again, something that's very difficult to convey through a video. But once we get underneath here, you'll see there's a very small amount of flexibility. And if you hear a cracking noise, there's a good possibility that you broke it. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But once you get under here, you can kind of just very carefully, slowly pry your way down the side and hope for the best. And we can get underneath here and just kind of do the same thing on the opposite side. And if you use something really flexible like this type of pry tool, you're going to be a lot safer than using something that doesn't give at all, because you'll be putting too much pressure against there. So the softer the tool in this situation, the better. And again, just take your time, exercise patience. And it's one of those things you have to get a feel for. But once it does separate, you'll see that it does kind of lift up from inside. But we've got a couple of strips of adhesive down at the bottom that we've got to separate also. So I just kind of stuck a card in there as a placeholder so it doesn't stick back together. These little things down here at the bottom, you just want to go ahead and peel those away and set them aside. We will be putting them back in when we reassemble the tablet. And then underneath them, you'll have a very thin strip of adhesive, usually on both sides. I believe I peeled the other one off when I removed that first piece, but you want to pull these back a little bit because they also overlap onto the LCD. And there's one more little piece down there that you'll see in a second that I'm going to go ahead and remove right here. And unfortunately, I can't tell you what every little one of these pieces does, but I recommend that you put everything back in exactly the same spot that you found it. As I mentioned earlier, these things are very sensitive and very prone to interference. So if you don't have them insulated properly at the bottom, you'll get ghost touching. You'll get a digitizer that only works on one side or the other. It's just got to go back together exactly the same way that you took it apart. It looks like I still do have this tape down here on the other side. So I'm not actually tearing it completely out. I'm just kind of bending it over towards the bottom end. And that'll give us some slack here on the LCD. So you can see we can go ahead and open this up and expose the panel behind it, which has a whole bunch of screws down each side. And these get a little complicated to remove and reinstall because it's also magnetic in a couple different places. So you'll find yourself kind of having to work around that property on the inside here. But go ahead and take these out. Make sure you keep them in order so that we can make it easy when we put it all back together. Now this thing, what you'll have to do is kind of arc it up in the center in order for it to come out. The way that it's wedged in here, it kind of pops into place. So if you kind of pull from the center so it bends just a little bit, you'll be able to get it to come out from the sides. And it's much easier going in than taking it out, actually. Underneath here, you can see this thing is mostly battery. We've got the logic board here on the left side of the frame and those two big cells for the battery. And then we've got 3 screws down here at the bottom, and they hold this retaining plate in, which goes over the top of the flex cables, which we want to be very careful not to disconnect until we're 100% certain we have disconnected the battery cable. So be very careful. This is where things can go bad. You absolutely have to disconnect the battery before you do anything else. That's going to be this one right here. And be very careful. There are components nearby that if you're not careful, you can easily damage. So once we've got this unplugged, we'll go ahead and proceed to disconnect the LCD and the digitizer. And then you'll see there's a certain arrangement of adhesive and pads on the inside here that we kind of have to work around. But the main thing is we like to get the LCD off, set it aside, keep it in as dust-free an environment as possible, maybe covered up with something. You don't want that thing to get dirty. You don't want any fragments of glass on it, and you don't want any fingerprints on it. This is the Digitizer Flex here, and this cable is, actually the interface is very sensitive. Underneath it, we've got some adhesive, and this whole thing's going to come out. Again, take note of the orientation of these cables. It'll make your life a lot easier if you know exactly how to bend them back into place. So I recommend don't throw this thing in the trash. Just set it off to the side so that you can compare it to your new part. Make sure you transfer over anything that your new part doesn't have, and then kind of pre-fold the flex cable into the same configuration that it has here. It's going to make your life a lot easier when you do the installation. All right, so we'll go ahead and clean this up. Make sure you get all of this residual adhesive off. Make sure there's no glass stuck to anything. Make sure there's no glass on the inside of the tablet. It should all be nice and clean. That way we get good adhesion when we install the new part. Right, so we've got a couple magnets here that are covered up by an adhesive. You can see one's missing here from the top. It actually came off on a separate piece of glass. We want to go ahead and heat those up, remove them, and transfer them over to the replacement part, as it doesn't come with those. It does happen to come with the front-facing camera guard, which is not always straight, so sometimes you have to straighten it out a little bit. This one was a little bit crooked. The tricky thing is we do want to, and actually this entire plastic module came off on in this particular situation. This doesn't always happen, but sometimes you'll pull off this little plastic guard. If you do, you need to transfer that over, or you can actually just set it back inside the tablet for now. Make sure you have it facing the right direction. Right, so down here on the bottom is where it gets a little tricky. These things, as they come from the factory, they do have a certain amount of insulation on the bottom, but just transferring this piece by itself will not always be effective as far as preventing the ghost touch issue that a lot of these things develop. So you can try peeling this tape off, moving it over, and in some cases it's really hit or miss. I find the most consistent way to do this is just to coat both sides with some capped on tape, but occasionally that can actually cause problems as well. So again, one of these things that makes this not the easiest repair in the world, not necessarily difficult, but definitely more complicated than a lot of other devices that you'll work with. Very, very precise here. You've got to get everything just right or you will have problems. So we kind of tape over these contacts here on the inside, and then we do have to add some insulation here shortly, which you'll see in a minute. Another thing you can do is add some Kapton tape down here at the bottom in these two positions, and most of the time that will prevent the ghost touch issues that these devices are so prone to. Now what I want to do is go ahead and keep this plastic on the inside of the screen just so we don't get any fingerprints or dust inside. I've just peeled it back a little bit so that we can go ahead and add some tape on the inside here. This is where, for whatever reasons, they're just very prone to interference, so we want to make sure we have this insulated. And I'll kind of show you how this is supposed to be, or what it's supposed to look like when it's finished. But we want to go right up to the very edge of where the screen is. Make sure you don't go too far, else you'll see that on the inside once you flip it back over. So this is one of the magnet for the bottom corner here. And again, we've got this whole issue of adhesive to work around, so you kind of have to peel it back. I don't want to remove it. I don't want to take all the tape off of the adhesive yet. So I'm just going to kind of peel it out of the way, stick this down, and then lay everything back on top of it. And do make sure you get that in the right direction. As well as in the right location. So this should be exactly in the same spot it was on the old screen. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and attach everything. Again, if you had any foam pads on the back of your cables and they're not on the new one, make sure that you transfer those over. And also there's a piece of insulation below this little PCB thing here at the bottom, so make sure that's taped over as well. You don't want it to be grounding out on the housing. Just the reverse of the removal. The most important thing, once again, being that you do not connect the battery until you have the LCD fully connected, and make sure you don't unplug it on accident while you're once you power it up or you have the power connected. Best way to test this is to go ahead and plug in those two, connect the battery last, and then you can put that panel back on with the 3 screws if you want to be safe. If you feel confident, you can just kind of hold it down. Just make sure that these don't get unplugged while you're testing it. And I highly recommend that before you remove the adhesive covers, go ahead and power it up, check your digitizer, make sure everything's working properly. You don't want to stick this all together and then have to take it apart again if you can avoid that. All right, so it looks like our digitizer is working okay, at least so far. Every once in a while, you might put it together and then start seeing some problems, which is unfortunate because you got to pull it apart again. But if you have added the Kapton tape, you should be okay most of the time. I really wish I could say that's 100%, but it never is. And just going to hit this with some compressed air. If you've got canned air on hand, that'll work as well. I want to avoid brushing this screen as much as possible. It's just never a good idea if you can avoid it. Now this is the tricky part. One of the tricky parts, I should say, is getting this stuff peeled off and then putting it all together. Mainly because one of the pieces of adhesives goes right behind the flex cable at the bottom there. So some of these are easier to get off than others. I like to use the plastic crowbar with a sharp edge. They're nice for separating the wax paper from the adhesive. And it looks like my magnet fell off there, so I'm going to have to put that back into place. And of course, the last thing you're going to do is peel off that plastic from inside the screen. Make sure you do not forget to do that. And again, if you've pre-folded your cable down at the bottom, it should all close up without too many complications. Getting that thing in the right position can be tricky sometimes, so you might have to look at it from the side. Make sure it's all folding over correctly. If not, it will start to lift up on that bottom right corner. Otherwise, everything should set in here perfectly as long as your corners aren't dented or anything. Power it up, and as long as it's working okay, I'd give it about 10-15 minutes. Make sure nothing lifts up or starts malfunctioning. If you found the video helpful, hit the like button and feel free to share it on the social network platform of your choice. Check out some of my recent repair and product review videos, and visit us on the web at gocellphonerepair.com. Thanks for watching.